Thank you for joining me this Friday afternoon. We're live on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, Rumble, and Telegram. So if you want to send a question for me to answer later in the second half of this stream, make sure you send your comment on Facebook or YouTube. Now, I missed last Friday because I was in the Senate estimates grilling the government on how they spend your money, our money. As some of you know from the videos, I don't always get answers in Senate estimates. It often takes, something to be taken on notice. Yet it was a very productive week in exposing the absolute waste and mismanagement in Canberra. And sometimes this Senate estimates is very, very tricky because one of my staffers thought ahead so far down the track that it took us 3 years to eventually ask his question because he had to get so many things done in the middle, in the interim months. So this is a strategic game we're playing. It's not always as it appears. So don't be disheartened if we don't get an answer. So what we'll be doing is uploading the videos of the last week onto my website, which is malcolmrobertsqld.com.au. Malcolm Roberts, that's with 2 L's, malcolmrobertsqld.com.au. And we'll be giving a much more detailed and in-depth wrap-up of the Senate estimates next week. I just want to mention a quick mention for the Malcolm Roberts Show number 3 with Dr. Philip Altman. Many of you started watching it on Wednesday's live stream. A really fantastic show. Now, I'd encourage you to go and watch the entire episode because Dr. Philip Altman is one of the best in the world. He's a former person a doctor who's worked 40 years in Big Pharma, with Big Pharma and with the Therapeutic Goods Administration. And he's been given a rap by prominent former barrister, as being the best producer of affidavits ever seen. So that presentation, that interview, that podcast with Dr. Philip Altman and myself is available on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. And it answers many questions because some people are saying, why are all these vaccine deaths, these COVID injection deaths? And others are saying, there are no deaths. Well, it explains why there are so many people who are dying and they're not being reported, and it explains the reason why some people don't feel a thing and other people die almost immediately from these injections. So go and have a look for yourself. It explains it. You'll be very, very surprised. We'll be talking more about what Dr. Philip Altman has done working with Americans and Australians. So, as I said, join me on Facebook or YouTube to leave your questions and I'll answer them in the second half of the live stream. Now, the first topic today is Pioneer Valley Dam protest. On last Saturday, I travelled to Mackay for a protest against the Palaszczuk's proposed pumped hydro. It's complete nonsense. Now that we definitely need more dams in this country, that's for sure, but they need to be built for the right reasons, not for wind and solar pumped hydro. Wind and solar pumped hydro are only possible because the national electricity market has been destroyed. It's actually a national electricity racket. It's been destroyed. That's the only way pumped hydro can work. We don't believe this will be ever built. It's just a thought bubble and it's just a distraction. I'll explain why in a minute. Now, local residents found out at Netherdale, which is in the Pioneer Valley in the hinterland from Mackay, found out they were going to be kicked out of their houses and the land flooded when they saw the item in the newspaper. No consultation, no care, no being heard. And that was one of the chief problems that the people at the protest that I addressed were talking about. No trust for the government. No, they're not being heard. As I said, this is just a thought bubble. Why? To win green votes in inner city. The people in the bush and the regions pay the price, and Palaszczuk harvests the votes from ignorant green supporters in inner city Brisbane. There's been no detail on what will be built or how it will be built, when it'll be built. Pumped hydro is usually a dog. We were told Snowy 2 was meant to be pumped hydro that would give up the world's largest battery for $2 billion. The cost, and I forecast all of this back when it was released. The cost is now estimated at up to $10 billion. I actually think that's closer to $14 billion. Plus possibly another $10 billion to get it connected with transmission lines that are needed. This Pioneer Valley pumped hydro at the back of Mackay will probably be worse than Snowy 2 because the initial cost is greater than the initial cost forecast of Snowy 2. Think of the consequences. Lives have been put on hold. Residents who were planning to move into Netherdale to be with their family can no longer do that. They can't get bank loans because what bank is going to take a mortgage over a house that's going to be flooded in a dam? The real reason this is being mooted now, apart from getting green votes, is to deflect from the absolute crisis that Mackay Hospital finds itself in. Mackay Hospital, we've been told by a doctor at the hospital, is now no longer a training hospital. We've been told that the Department of Health in Queensland now advises that people coming from the coalfields, Moranbah, etc., they don't anymore go to Mackay Hospital for maternity ward. They don't go to Rocky. They either bypass and go to Gladstone or bypass and go to Townsville, which is also, understand, to be crumbling. What we need to do is end all climate-related policies and get back to basics and restore the primacy of energy. The primacy of energy is fundamental in a modern civilization. The second thing I want to talk about is the treaty, the voice. If you're still unsure about what the voice was really about, Labor let it slip this week. Indigenous Australians Minister Linda Burney confirmed that the government was preparing to establish a Makarrata Treaty Commission, which would negotiate a treaty with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders for reparations. A treaty is what former Green Senator Lydia Thorpe has argued for. To have a treaty, you have to have a separate nation. A treaty might mean establishing completely separate legal systems only for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. That could lead to the non-Indigenous in this country paying rent. It could lead to the non-Indigenous paying reparations for something that happened more than 200 years ago. The destruction of sovereignty is the third reason why I oppose this voice. It's part of a global campaign to subvert nations, national sovereignty. They're doing this with the Indigenous in many countries around the world, many Western countries around the world, to destroy national sovereignty. They won't help the Aboriginals in this country and the Torres Strait Islanders. They will worsen what's happening in this country, but they will get control of our country by bypassing the Constitution. It means dividing us on the basis of race. One of our key laws in this country prohibits that. The Constitution prohibits it. This is a racist act by the Albanese Labor government. You know, Martin Luther King had a dream. He said that his children wouldn't be judged by the colour of their skin, but by the content of their character. That still holds. This voice proposal from Anthony Albanese is the complete opposite of Martin Luther King's dream. The Albanese voice will only be a divisive nightmare that is being sprung on us by the globalists. So vote no to the voice. Hands off our Constitution. And that reminds me, the last thing we need is a tired politician's constitution. We need to keep it as the people's constitution. I'll say it again and I'll say it forever. Australia is the only country in the world in which the Constitution was voted on by the people of Australia. The only country. The only people who can change our Constitution are the voters of this country, the citizens of this country. Don't fall for this trick to get, good on you, Chame. He just said he's going to vote no. That's what I'll be voting as well, because I want Australia first and I want us united as one nation. Keep it as the people's constitution. Now we've got members of parliament in South Australia, state parliament, Victoria, New South Wales, and Mark Latham's doing a phenomenal job. So is Sarah Game in South Australia. That woman is a fighter, bright and energetic. And we've got a marvellous member of parliament in the Queensland State Parliament in Steve Andrew. He is a man who really cares. And then the locals at the Mackay protest endorsed that with a very, very strong round of applause for Steve when I said how good he is. We've also got, so that's 4 states. We've got politicians in fighting for the people of Australia in those states. And we've got 2 senators, in Pauline Hanson and myself, in the federal parliament. So we've just had a rise because Ricky Lee Tyrrell has been voted in Victoria. So look into the upper house. Ricky Lee Tyrrell made her maiden speech to Victorian Parliament this week. I haven't had a chance to watch it, So I'll be looking at that before actually commenting on it. But I want to say that the comments about his speech have been phenomenally favourable. I've worked with Ricky extensively, and she's a fighter. She is a fighter. She deserves that seat because she believes in serving her constituents. And that's one of the things she mentioned in her maiden speech, that she will be a servant to the people of Victoria and Australia. And that's what every elected member of Parliament should be doing, but very few people do. So congratulations, Ricky. We're glad to have you in Victorian Parliament in the One Nation team. Next point, superannuation. Well, what a surprise, eh? Surprise, surprise, surprise. Labor wants to get their grubby paws on your super, our assets. As always, the problem with Labor is they always eventually run out of other people's money. Actually, they're the notes I made, but really, there's not much difference between Labor and Liberal. They're always wanting to use other people's money. But the Labor Party does it more quickly. I've got a good mate in New South Wales, John McRae. He's in his 80s, very, very bright man, very practical man. He says there's not much difference between Labor and Liberal. In the Liberal Party, you're in a boat with people rowing towards a huge waterfall and about to go off it. With the Labor Party, you're in a speedboat heading to the same waterfall. It's just that the Labor Party will get there quickly. Now, remember before the election last year, Anthony Albanese said, and I'll quote, "There will be no change to superannuation." So have a look at this clip that our staff has assembled and from the election campaign. Notice the date.
This grab here is clear. In the election campaign, the Now PM is saying no more super taxes.
Does Labor commit to the current super arrangements for self-funded retirees and other superannuants? And do you rule out any increases to super taxes and changes to caps?
We've said we have no intention of making any super changes. One of the things that we're doing in this campaign is we're making all of our policies clear.
Remember what Julia Gillard said? There will be no carbon dioxide taxes in a government I lead. Well, Anthony Albanese said there will be no taxes introduced on super. May the 2nd, if you notice the date. Oh, yes, Peter Parker's just made a comment. Labor plus Liberal equals the Uni Party. Exactly. Policies are almost identical. So Labor is actually breaking Labor promises to go after our super. Now they want to make big changes. It's a broken promise. Even if you've got $1 million in super, that's your money. That is your money, not the government's. Hands off our super, Albo. Leave it to the people. They earned it. Now let's have a look at the Australian Energy Market Operator, which has said in a recent report that the Australian Energy Market Operator is warning about the risk of future blackouts as coal, oil and gas are being forced artificially out of the system, electricity system, and wind and solar are being forced in with your subsidies, our subsidies. And that's raising the price of electricity. Now, this man, Chris Bowen, the Minister for Climate Change and Energy, is an absolute nutcase based on his behaviour. He called it good news, yet then contradicted himself because said we need to prepare for that to happen, and so we need to build in contingencies. So nothing really to worry about, just the destruction of our electricity sector. Oh, look over there. Look at Ukraine while we destroy our country. We'll destroy our country and we'll keep your attention on Ukraine. The Australian Electricity Market Operator forecasts every single mainland state, listen to this, will be in breach of their reliability standard from 2027, in breach of its own standards for reliability. This is mainly due to the fact that coal-fired power stations, representing 13% of our country's electricity needs, are scheduled to retire. Coal represents more than 13%, but the scheduled retirement schedules are of 13% of our country's entire electricity needs. That's already on top of a system that is seeing more and more unreliable wind and solar, insecure, asynchronous, unstable, unreliable, very expensive wind and solar. So you will be seeing much more increases in cost of living because energy costs go right through the whole sector of our economy. Everyone touches electricity, families, individuals, small business, large business, employers, employees. So we're going to be retiring under Chris Bowen, retiring another 13% of our country's electricity generation. And they won't be replaced because Greens policies dictate that. The United Nations policies that the Greens and Labor Party implement, that the Liberal Party and National Party introduced through the Kyoto Protocol, which John Howard implemented, through the Paris Agreement, and through the 2050 net zero. All three introduced by the Liberal National Party. The fact is that forcing wind and solar into the grid and sending coal broke, because coal cannot compete with a destabilized grid, this has led to this forecast. And Chris Bowen thinks putting more wind and solar in it is going to solve it. The problem has been created by wind and solar entering the grid. He thinks the solution is more wind and solar. It's just a lie. I'll call him out right now in public. It is a lie. This is just going to pour fuel on the cost of living fire. Chris Bowen is going to make electricity much more expensive until you can't afford it, until we can't afford it, so he can win inner city green votes. So I call on ending all climate-related energy policies and get back to basics. Restore the primacy of electricity and energy and restore our national sovereignty. Do what's in the national interest. Now, I'm a naturally very positive and optimistic person. I always have been. And I love to build things. I'm a constructor, not a destroyer. While continuing to draw attention to policies destroying our nation, because I'll be returning to building. There are so many things in politics that are entirely negative, but we'll be focusing more and more on what we can do to restore our country, reclaim our country. One of the things I introduced recently is Project Iron Boomerang, taking coal from eastern Queensland to Western Australia and taking with the backloading then with trains of iron ore back to the east coast. Having steel mills at both in the east coast around Moranbah and the west coast around the Pilbara, and exporting iron and steel. We have introduced that as a project into the Parliament. We have also succeeded in getting an inquiry into it, and we've succeeded in getting Labor and Liberal National Party support for the project. So there are many more aspects of it that I'll talk about in the future. But this is an absolute winner for our country. We've got foreign companies, Australian companies, really keen to invest, to build a railway line that will open up a power corridor, a rail corridor, an internet corridor, and a water corridor, because they'll be taking water from the Argyle Dam in the Ord River scheme right through. So remote communities, Indigenous communities, Aboriginal communities, right across the north of Australia will be getting water through that central corridor. Okay, I've rushed through my notes there because we'll go to your questions now. If you're with us on YouTube or Facebook, send your questions now in the comments and I'll try and answer them right away. Why aren't you voting yes on The Voice then? Well, I just explained it. It's number one, it is divisive, it is racist. I will not support a racist policy. Number two, it aims to destroy our Constitution. And I will go into that in more detail one day in the future. It aims to destroy, it enables the destruction of our sovereignty. And we don't have any details on it. It goes against the fundamental constitutional values of our country. And it is aimed to divide our country. The same thing has happened in many other countries, or is happening in many other countries around the world. It's an external threat from the United Nations, the World Economic Forum Alliance that was formed in 2018. I will not be voting for The Voice. I'll be voting no to The Voice. Live Free Oz says, it's about time we value added and became independent. We were once independent. Australia once made just about everything we needed in this country. We were independent. Then these dopey buggers in Canberra and some of our state parliaments fell for the United Nations crap called interdependency. So we were independent. We fell for this interdependence, rubbish. Now, when you think about it, interdependence means we are dependent on someone else and someone else is dependent on us. Sounds lovely. Sounds like the way we need to make the world. Rubbish. Because the moment you introduce interdependence, we introduce dependence on other people for some things. We cannot rely on others. Australians have proven that we've got people who've got the strong work ethic, got initiative, got innovation. There's no one else that can match us per capita for our innovations that have happened throughout the last 120 years or so. And in fact, the United Nations has said that Australia is the most blessed country in the world when it comes to mineral and energy resources and metal resources. We've also got we've got a wonderful climate. We can grow just about everything any time of the year, and somewhere in Australia we've got good soils in many places. We've got water that's not being managed, it's being mismanaged and wasted. We've got a huge opportunity with markets in the north. We've got a huge potential. And Australia, back around 120 years ago, was number one in income per capita, income per person, number one in gross domestic product per person. We've slipped and slipped and slipped following globalist policies from the United Nations World Economic Forum Alliance. So we need to get ourselves back on top. We don't make cars anymore. We don't make so many things anymore. We export our iron ore and we export our coal, the best coking coal in the world. But we don't use it here other than small quantities in Whyalla steel mills and Port Kembla. We could be the powerhouse for the steel blast furnace for the world. We would be making the best quality steel in the world, and we're doing it at a price that would make us very, very competitive. We'd be easily the number one lowest cost producer in the world. And if you think about it, now, we know that carbon dioxide from human activity does not impact climate. It is a complete nonsense. But if you believe in that crap, then this makes perfect sense, because instead of putting iron ore in ships, which produce a lot of carbon dioxide, and sending it to Japan and China and Korea, and coal on the other side of the country in ships and taking it to Japan and China and Korea, we would eliminate that ship traffic and just have rail traffic across the continent. We'd eliminate a lot of truck traffic. We'd eliminate some rail traffic in other countries. So we would be dramatically reducing the carbon dioxide produced in this country. Now, I don't think that matters. But if you're a greenie and you believe this crap, then you've got to vote for the iron boomerang. It would dramatically reduce the production of carbon dioxide from human activity. So yes, very, very important to add value. Julie says, how do you stay sane in estimates? I find myself screaming at the screen, she says, that there's morons you have to deal with. Yeah, see, I understand the game, and I'm not making fun of you, but there are so many things in Parliament that if I wasn't calm would really get me angry. But I have a high anger threshold, and I understand it's their ignorance and their stupidity, and sometimes, quite frankly, Julie, their dishonesty. So you can't feel what we can feel in Canberra. We feel that same dishonesty and hiding, that deceit. But you can't see what we're doing. As I said a minute ago, in Senate estimates, sometimes we have got a plan that's 3 or 4 Senate estimates down the track, sometimes 3 years down the track, to get the last morsel of material out of them. Sometimes we ask questions in Senate estimates, one after the other, leading people down the path, and then we ambush them with another question. There's a lot of strategy involved in Senate estimates. It's not quite what you think. It's a bit like watching cricket, or a bit like watching American football. You've got to understand the complexities to really appreciate the game. So that's how I stay sane. But this is something that could challenge all of us in terms of sanity, Julie. This is from the Financial Review yesterday in the Financial Review in the evening. New digital identity system to get the go-ahead. That's the Financial Review. And I made a few notes from it as I read the article. It was sent to me, the link was sent to me by a lady who lives in Toowoomba and gives me lots of memes, because she has access to fantastic memes, or she makes some fantastic memes, and we get them out there. I use a lot of memes on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter because it is a good way to send up all these ridiculous situations, send up all the stupidity, send up all the hilarity, and we have got to make fun of these things and have some fun doing it. So these are some of the key points that came out of the article written by Tom Burton in the Financial Review yesterday evening. Quote, "The move for digital identity will pave the way for linking public and private services to enable a single, easy way to register a new baby, enrol for school, wind up the affairs of deceased parents, to enrol to vote, and to begin employment." Just inject me with it right now. See what they're doing? They're trying to say how to make your life easier, but they don't tell you how it's going to make your life in captivity in the near future if we buy this. Then another quote: MasterCard, Australia Post, and Australian Payments Plus developed identity verification solutions several years ago, but have been awaiting legislation to give them liability protection for any errors. Oh, I'm from the government and I'm here to help you. This will look after you. It'll protect you. Does that sound familiar? Like climate alarm, like COVID alarm. Exaggerations. Another quote: Senator Gallagher has signalled she wants to focus on getting the federal MyGov ID credential working. After how many years? And it's still not working? Working and able to interoperate with all tiers of government and private services such as banking, telecommunications, healthcare and transportation. Again, wonderful promises that they'll make it easy for you to connect with everyone. All your services linked together. So easy. Just pull out your phone and get into whatever you want, and we'll take care of the digital identity issue. The same convenience will be used to trap us. They will collect and harvest the information from your banking, from every transaction you make. Every transaction you make, they'll put us on a central bank digital currency. The Reserve Bank has already admitted, in answer to my questions in Senate estimates a couple of Senate estimates ago, that that's what they're working on. And they're working with a global central bank digital currency for global operations. So we'll be connected globally. Can you imagine what that is? Imagine Soros in charge of our life. Imagine the UN or Klaus Schwab in charge of our life. No thanks. Imagine Bill Gates, that murderer, in charge of our lives. Imagine Anthony Fauci having the trigger on our digital vaccine passports, which are really digital prisons. Healthcare. Everything about your healthcare file will be uploaded. And it might be bought by a foreign company. Now, I was the first to bust this open in this country about the digital identity. These are some of the things we raised 18 months ago. It might have even been longer. Because the Morrison government, the Morrison-Joyce Liberal Nationals, introduced this, the draft legislation, the draft background explanatory memorandum on this legislation when they were in power. So the Liberal Nationals introduced it to society. Labor is now talking about introducing it to Parliament. They work together. So now listen to this. The acceleration, this is another quote from Tom Burton's article. The acceleration of the rollout of legislation for the much-awaited federated scheme comes after a review of the MyGov service portal by former Telstra and IBM chief David Thodey. Called for the new identity system to be implemented urgently, just like what any good globalist would say. Disgraceful. As I said, the previous government prepared draft legislation to support the new identity system, but it was not introduced to Parliament. But now the opposition spokesman, Liberal Paul Fletcher, called for the government to quote, take concrete action towards implementation of a national digital identity system. They're telling us they're going to do this to protect our energy, protect our data, protect our security of our data. Where do most data breaches come from? They come primarily from governments and Silicon Valley, Facebook, YouTube, Google, Apple. This is where most of the breaches come from, and government. And we're expecting these bastards to fix it? Come on. They want to get it together, sell it, give control of someone else to our data. And as I've said before, this will mean that your health data, for you to access your health data, you will have to pay for it to a company that owns it. And that company may be in South America, it may be in Africa, it may be in America. And they will have every piece of information on you, what your transactions are, where you travel, what you say on Facebook, YouTube, Google, what you say on any digital platform. As Macca says, what are my views on 25-minute cities? This is part of the game, to control us. I've said right from the start that electric vehicles are not to produce different vehicles, to give you choice. They're to produce no vehicles. Electric vehicles are huge consumers of resources in our planet. That's why they cost so much. They will never, ever compete with petrol-driven cars on price. Never. because they use so many resources and so much energy to be made. They're a fraud. And so, yes, Kerry Lowe, 25-minute cities are 15-minute prisons. That's what they're doing. So the energy we're seeing, solar and wind, is not to create different energy. It's to create reduced energy so they can control it. They're already talking. I put up a post the other day. They're already talking about rationing electricity in the United Kingdom, following the same policies our government is following. They want to ration, to control, and to jack up the price. Thank you, Mr. Motor Nerd. Electric vehicles are controllable. Absolutely correct. They can control whether or not you go. And if your travel arrangements show that you've had too much travel, will you be chopped until you get back to what they say you need to travel. 25-minute cities or 20-minute cities or 15-minute cities, whatever you want to call them. I think it's originally 15-minute cities. They're there to restrict you. You need to work, live, shop, move about within a 15-minute radius of where you're centered, where you're living. Now think about this. Exploitation of workers was only possible where you had workers in a captive situation. For example, my grandfather was born and raised and died in Wales, in a little valley in Wales. The generation before him, it was a big deal to go to the next valley. They had to work for their employers in their coal mine in their valley in Wales. Now we have people commuting from Gosford in New South Wales, 100 kilometres or so to Sydney. We have the same up here in Queensland. We have commuters living on the Gold Coast commuting to Brisbane every day. If they don't have that choice, then they're captive of the employer in that region. And guess who the employer will be? It'll be a major multinational company, probably owned by Bill Gates or George Soros or one of the other globalists, and they will be telling you under what conditions you work. This sounds like feudalism, where we are serfs and we produce for the globalists, and they give us enough to keep just to survive. Peter Parker asked, does anyone read the legislation before it is voted on? Yes. Yes, I don't vote on it unless it's read. Now, I can't possibly read every piece of legislation. So I've got some very, very effective staff, and Pauline Hanson's staff, they read together, they read every piece of legislation. Then we have discussions about it, and then we form our mind on what to vote for. We also have briefings from the government and people who oppose it. We also have briefings from lobby groups, from concerned citizens, from active groups like who want to discuss their concerns with legislation, who want to put forward changes and amendments. So we do a lot of listening, Pauline and I. That's the fundamental part of serving the people of Australia and Queensland, to listen, to understand what people need. And there are some amazing citizens who do so much work on their bill, on a bill that concerns them, and they will feed us with information. So we get a lot of sources, but we do read every piece of legislation. Not me personally, but someone in our office. I couldn't possibly do my job if I had to read every piece of legislation. Some pieces I read, most I don't, but we always ensure that every legislation is read by our staff or by myself. Rob Atkinson, Malcolm, we look forward to hosting you on the 17th of March at Widgie, west of Gympie. Mate, I'm looking forward to getting up there. Malcolm, there's another Malcolm up there who's been communicating with me for many years because of the council, I think. You're saying Powerlink is planning to run huge power lines over many private landowners between the Barumba pumped hydro project, another bloody pumped hydro project, another waste of taxpayer money, and Woolooga substation. The transmission lines must be built on public land, namely national parks and native and state forest wherever possible. Mate, people don't realise that our agriculture is threatened by vast tracts of solar panels. Our environmental system is threatened by vast areas given up to that insidious wind turbines. These things are destroying our electricity sector. They're destroying our prime agricultural land. They're destroying our pristine environment in the name of the environment. It doesn't make sense. It's bullshit. And what they're doing is destroying our manufacturing. So we've looked into this thoroughly. Every country in the world, as they increase the proportion in any country that uses wind and solar, which is not all of them by far, any country which increases the use of wind and solar increases electricity prices as well. Every country. Why? Because, for example, with a wind turbine, per unit energy, a coal-fired power station needs about 35 tons of steel. For the same amount of energy out of a wind turbine needs 540 odd tons of steel. When you look at that, it becomes so obvious that wind turbines can never compete. Then when you look at all the hassles and the inefficiencies in wind turbines, it will never compete. Fundamentally, wind is so low in energy density, the magic of coal and gas and nuclear and uranium is high energy density. Nuclear, of course, has the highest energy density. When you have high energy density, you can get a lot more energy for lower cost. When you get lower cost electricity, which is what Australia had, we used to have the world's lowest electricity prices. We now have amongst the highest electricity prices, all artificially created by stupid Liberal, National, Labor, Greens governments that have put in place solar and wind. So we're destroying ourselves. Yeah, and destroying birds, as Tanuri says, as they fly into wind turbines. Bird choppers, that's what they are, giant bird choppers. And they're also detrimental to human health. They have severe problems with, is it infra or ultrasound? The humans can't actually hear it, but we can detect it. Unconsciously, we can detect it. And it causes some people enormous grief. It destroys their lives. So it's not just birds, it's also humans that are destroyed. Michelle says something true too. All the mining for renewables and massive batteries. Look, I'm in favour of mining. Only as much as we sensibly need. Only as much as we can afford to use. What they've done is they've distorted the price of wind and solar, artificially raised the revenue for wind and solar through subsidies. That means that wind and solar, which could never, ever be competitive on themselves, are now artificially increasing the consumption of rare earth metals and other exotic materials, and they're being mined all around the world. The amount of lithium being used is staggering. What the forecasts are to fulfill the government's plan and the United Nations World Economic Forum's supposed plan is impossible to fulfill. It cannot be done. The price of lithium has gone up by about 13 times to $78 a ton, I think it is now. $78 from $6 to 78, 13 times. That's just with this demand. With the future forecast demand, it'll skyrocket even more. That means these things will become more expensive. Everything in life will become more expensive because of the pressure they put on consumption of resources, resource prices, copper prices. Everything will rise. Copper in here. Mining products in here. We need to mine, but we only need to mine as much as we need, not artificially stimulated by government. So government, and the Greens in particular, are stimulating the mining industry, because the only way to get these minerals for wind and solar and wind turbines and solar is by mining. Mining at a far, far higher rate than today. Simon asks, how do we stop digital IDs, carbon footprint allocations, social credit systems, and a total destruction of freedom? Very, very simple, really, but it requires work. And by the way, carbon footprint allocations is essentially a social credit system, so they can control what you do. If you say something on Facebook, you'll get a lower carbon dioxide allocation. And I was in a conference here in Brisbane, must have been early 2010s, must have been around 2012, 2011, something like that. And an Aussie consultant addressed the conference, and he said he'd been working for the Blair government, so that tells you when it was, quite some time ago, the Blair government in Britain. And he was working on carbon dioxide trading systems, which are a complete scam, and 97% of it, according to Europol, the European police, is infested with corruption. But he said that he was called on to work on a carbon dioxide trading system. And near the end of his work, that was mainly for commercial operators, near the end of his work, the Blair government asked him just for his thoughts on putting in place individual carbon dioxide limits. So I'm laughing at all the big people out there, because I'm only little. I produce little carbon dioxide. You produce a lot more. You're going to get hammered. But they'll use it to control all of us. I'm serious. This is what is going on in the minds and hearts of these mongrels running our governments in the West. So how do we stop it? Well, look at the success we had. My office alone initiated the fight back on the cash ban bill that was introduced into the lower house of Parliament and voted for by the Labor Party, by the National Party, by the Liberal Party. It came to the Senate, but we had got wind of it before it went into the House of Representatives. And we created such a fuss that every single crossbench senator and even the Greens voted against the cash ban bill. Stood up against the cash ban bill. And then we worked with the rank and file members, the grassroots members of the Liberal Party and the grassroots members of the Labor Party, and got them fired up and told them what was coming. And they squashed the cash ban bill because they put so much pressure on their sitting members of Parliament and their senators that when it arrived in the Senate, we got it consigned to a committee. And it never came out of the committee. And when it didn't come out of the committee, I moved a motion to get rid of it off the Senate books. Now, so we succeeded there. But the bastards came back, they came back, and they want to put essentially a cash ban bill, a cash ban ruling into the digital identity bill. So they don't give up, which means we can't give up. The moment we give up, we're done. We're into slavery, we're into feudalism, and that's it. Social credit, central bank digital currencies, all to control us. So just remember that. Now, another thing is that I put out a video to celebrate how we, the people of the world, right around the world, not just Australia, not just my office, but people around the world, rose up against the World Health Organization or the World Health Congress's international health regulations, and they're rising up against the pandemic treaty. That sent a clear signal to the United Nations and the World Economic Forum. And they have squashed the international health regulations that were going to bring in UN control, UN mandates, UN dictates on restrictions about a future virus, vaccine injections with a digital passport, which are really digital prisons. Unless you give in to their injection, you can't travel, you can't move, you can't possibly do other things that you'll need a passport for, like buy food. There's some people around the world, some countries around the world, where they're even talking about banning people who weren't injected from supermarkets. That's starvation. This is Nazi stuff. So that was that international health regulations recent proposal by some member countries was squashed because of the uprising around the world. So remember, we, the voters, the citizens, are the only people who can change our constitution. The constitution is our governing instrument, governing entity. We control that. Politicians in Canberra have forgotten that we work for you. Remind them frequently. Remind them by visiting their offices and telling them. Remind them by telephoning them. Remind them by personal letters, not emails, personal letters, signed, handwritten or typed, it doesn't matter. Tell them they will be smashed in the next election if they put in place a digital identity. Warn them. We've done it several times now. We're also having an effect on the World Economic Forum. The World Economic Forum, like every political entity, doesn't give rarely names an opposing outfit. The World Economic Forum a few months ago, on one of its pages, called out Australia for, what was it now, homophobia, I think, genderphobia, transgenderism, genderphobia, and racism. They called out Australia for those things. We're none of those. But then they went a step further, and I don't think they've ever done this before. They called out One Nation. Why? Because we have been so effective in smashing and exposing their agenda. Pauline Hanson was the first member of federal parliament to call out Agenda 21, the UN's Agenda 21, which has now become Agenda 2030, back in 1996. Agenda 21 was introduced at the Rio conference in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, by a massive orchestrated effect by the UN. 4 years later, in her first year in Parliament, she called it out. When I learned about it back around 2010 or so, I started calling it out. My first speech, my maiden speech in the Senate, I called it out. And I called for an exit from the United Nations. So we've got to stand up. A very good friend of mine said, Malcolm, please, when you get into the Senate, don't mention Agenda 21. He knew it was real. I'll show you this book. At first, governments denied it existed. There's many, many thicker volumes behind this one with the detail. At first, they denied it existed. Then they said, oh, yeah, it exists, we were wrong, but we don't have to implement it. They were already implementing it. John Howard was the major implementer of UN Agenda 21. Every Prime Minister since has implemented it. Paul Keating was the first to start it, but John Howard was the biggest implementer of it. Liberal, Labor, Nationals, and especially the Greens. It exists and it's real. And so the best way to do it, best way to oppose it is to stand up. Now, we've been called out so they exactly, Mel Gleeson, they don't like Pauline Hanson because she can see through the bullshit they are pulling. Exactly. She's got a very, very strong bullshit detector and goes right through the point, right through to the core of it. So the answer to the previous question was stand up, speak out, help your friends to understand it, educate your friends, educate your workmates, educate your kids, educate your social friends, your sporting friends. If you go to church, educate your churchgoers. People who, because of the gross mismanagement of COVID, many people are now awake. But whereas before probably about 5% of the people were awake, now about only 15% are, I'd say. So we need to do a good job of educating others and educate them on the facts and educate them on the data and educate them on the consequences to our lives. This is a very real and serious threat. It's just, in many ways, it's the same as the Soviet threat of putting people in gulags. The gulag will be in your house and it'll be turned into a miserable place. Australia has the world's best people, free at the moment, open, have plenty of initiative, good work ethic, entrepreneurs galore. We are the most inventive people in the world. Per capita, we have invented more than anyone else. We have abundant resources. We're blessed with major metal resources, major energy resources, coal, liquid natural gas. We're the world's #1 exporters of energy, but we can't use our energy here in this country the way it's going. We have a wonderful climate that varies naturally. It has extremes like it's always had. It's not changing. It's not changing at all. No one's been able to show me that it's changing. CSIRO, no. BOM, Bureau of Meteorology, no. Federal ministers, no. Federal members of Parliament, Senate, I've written to the lot. No one's been able to provide me with any evidence, and we'll talk more about that later. But the point is, we've got this wonderful climate. We can grow almost anything, almost any time of the year. We've got the soils, we've got the water. We've got a good, stable political system. We need to reclaim our sovereignty. We've got massive markets up north that are hungry for clean food, clean fibre. We can produce that while we're, and we've got enormous potential. We've got the iron boomerang. We've got potentially the cheapest energy in the world. It used to be the cheapest electricity. It's now amongst the most expensive because of artificial restrictions. Remove the artificial restrictions. Get Australians back to being in Australia. Free Australia. We'll be right on top of the world again. Any more questions? Roy, what a good question. Where do you put the waste from all the batteries and the solar crap and wind crap? Exactly, mate. They don't recycle solar panels and wind turbine blades for a very simple reason. There's too much energy needed to recycle them. Too much energy. It's not cost effective to recycle them, so they bury them. They bury the bastards. And they become toxic. Solar panels contain some really strong toxins, carcinogens. So where do you put the waste from? And the batteries, we haven't even started on disposing of them yet. But that's something I've been saying for years. Batteries in particular, but also solar panels. What do you do with them? They're huge consumers of resources. huge consumers of resources. That's why they will never, ever be cheap and effective and efficient. Never. They can't be. The energy generated from a solar panel is tiny. The energy generated from wind turbine is tiny. And yet the costs, the capital costs of making solar panels and wind turbines is huge because they're huge consumers of energy and resources in their manufacturing. So you've got enormous cost and low energy. So the per capita, the unit cost of electricity for every unit of electricity is huge. And it can never be any different. The laws of physics show that. So, and then there's a fundamental thing with solar. The sun only shines 12 hours a day, half the day. In winter, good luck with that. Psychedelic. I love your name there. Psychedelic 44. National Bank ? Yes, Australia took off when we had our Commonwealth Bank, when it was a people's bank. The original Commonwealth Bank was brought in legislation that the Fisher Labor government brought in 1910, and I think the Commonwealth Bank came into existence in 1911. It was under the what do they call him? The first governor of the Commonwealth Bank was Denison Miller. The bank, get this, the bank was the creation of King O'Malley, I think it was King O'Malley, who was in the federal parliament from South Australia. He was a Yank who came down here to live, and he came from a banking family or connections with who worked for the bank, so he had strong connections with the banks. And he realized how they make money. They literally, as the Reserve Bank confirmed in a question I put to it some time ago, that they make electronic journal entries. In the old days, they made handwritten journal entries, but now it's electronic journal entries. They create money out of thin air. They create money out of thin air. So essentially, what happens is they have control of the money supply, they have control of the economy, and the Commonwealth Bank took that as a central bank that was the people's bank, and it acted as a central bank. It also funded regional, it funded business, it developed our country because of that. It developed massive infrastructure projects because of that. Cheap money. Didn't cause inflation because it was funding active investments in infrastructure, which are productive capacity. So as you invest in the productive capacity, it's not inflationary because you're increasing the productive capacity of the country. And so that's why Australia took off economically, and our growth developed. We only had around 5 million people from memory back in those days. But here's the deal. Denison Miller, the first governor of the Commonwealth Bank, died suddenly, unexpectedly, with questions around his death in 1923. Because, and then after that, the Commonwealth Bank was steadily dismantled by both the Labor Party and Liberal National Party governments. Dismantled. Why? Because the fundamental thing that attracts me even more about the Commonwealth Bank, or a strong people's bank, is the accountability it brings. At the moment, governments in this country are beholden to the big four banks. The big four banks have no real competition. They squash the little banks. They couldn't squash the original Commonwealth Bank. Not the current Commonwealth Bank is owned by the Globalists now and controlled by the Globalists. The original Commonwealth Bank was a people's bank, and they gave money at competitive interest rates, which always kept the private banks on their toes. In America, there is the state of North Dakota. It has a people's bank, and that people's bank lends to small businesses, other businesses, farmers, rural, citizens. It is the only bank that has made a profit every year since it came into existence. Every year. It has done remarkably well, and North Dakota is in good shape because of it. Our country was in good shape when we had a Commonwealth Bank that was a people's bank, that was a central bank, not a privately owned bank like it is now. That's what we need. There, is that a good enough answer for you, mate? National Bank. We need one. Oh, and by the way, Australia Post has a network of branches all around Australia. In Japan, they have a highly successful people's bank that is called the Postal Bank. The post office branches are the bank branches. We can do the same here. There's another country, I've forgotten where it is, does the same. New Zealand, I think, has a People's Bank. We could do the same here. We've got post offices that are falling in postal revenue because of the falling in postal services, people using electronic transfer of documents. And what we're seeing now is you could replace all of them. The banks are pulling out, shutting down bank branches in regional areas, shutting down the availability of cash in small towns and regional communities, even shutting down ATMs in capital cities. So they're trying to get rid of cash. With Australia Post, we could have it back straight away. So that's wonderful. Thanks for listening in. I think I'll call that quits for Friday. I've got another session to do later on this evening with Chaz, and so he'll be posting that out later on whatever he wants to talk about. So we will keep our weekly communications up, and we'll also be doing more podcasts as well, just like Philip Altman. So go and listen to Philip Altman on the podcast that's on our website, and also on Facebook. I think it's on YouTube as well. So thank you very much for listening, and we'll be with you next week.